Hello, dear friends. The biblical story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden is a parable that describes a monumental event that took place approximately 6,000 years ago and completely changed the destiny of humankind. Adam was a man of the species of Homo sapiens, like we are, men and women of this species, and he awoke. He was the first. According to this story, he was the first man to awaken to human consciousness. Now, this does not mean that consciousness was new. It had been in all of our ancestors. We as a species were created with spiritual consciousness as a unique endowment to our makeup. In other words, there were many species roaming the earth at the time prior to Adam, including Homo sapiens. But none of these other species were created with the endowment of consciousness. Only mankind. And that set us apart, although prior to Adam, this faculty of spiritual consciousness was, for all intents and purposes, asleep. It was dormant. It was not active. And therefore, prior to Adam, human beings were very much like the other species that roamed the earth. But what the Bible describes to us is that approximately 6,000 years ago, this great event took place in which one of our kind, or it might have been more than one, but at least one of our kind awoke to this endowment of consciousness. And from that time forward, consciousness in human life became very active and very impactful. In other words, it really, from that time forward, shaped human life and human existence in many, many ways. And that is why we say that this has been the age of Adam. Ever since that happened, we've been living in an age of time that is expressive of not just the awakening of consciousness, but also the outworking of consciousness in its seed state. This is an important distinction to understand. Adam awoke to consciousness in a very well-defined state, and this state is described in the parable. It's and we actually live this description every day, even now. All human beings are living this description. And what it is a seed state of consciousness that is awoke, or it is awakened, and it is active. But it is right now bound to certain limitations. And those limitations are descriptive of a well-defined state of consciousness. And I've talked about those limitations and in many other videos. Um, so Adam awoke, and from that time forward, consciousness became a very impactful part of human life. And most people, when they think about consciousness, they don't really understand the ways in which it impacts human life, the many ways. They think that consciousness is very much an aspect of mind that is active only at certain times when we become conscious, when we feel suddenly uh, um, conscious of the present moment and of what we're feeling, of what we're going through, of what we're experiencing. Those are moments when we feel consciousness at work. But in truth, consciousness is much bigger than that, and it has been shaping human life much more than we realize. Other people have come to understand that consciousness is spiritual, that it's actually a spiritual endowment, that when we are drawn to some kind of spiritual activity, um, could be religious, it could just be um, a spiritual practice, it could be any kind of spiritual focus. When we are drawn to that and begin to explore that, people have begun to understand that this is also somehow indicative of consciousness at work. And what many people do not realize is that this entire age of man's expression on the earth has been impacted by consciousness. We have, whether we are spiritual or religious or secular, we have had consciousness at work in the human community. And we've had very many amazing uh, outcomes of this, but it hasn't always been easy. This is another thing that people don't really understand about consciousness. They think that it's a completely benign faculty, and it's not. Consciousness is actually, uh, in the same way that we uh, can fly to the heavens spiritually or religiously or through our endowment of consciousness, we can also be cast down into hell through suffering and torment of mind. This is also consciousness at work, and many people throughout this age have unfortunately been on that end of things. The reason for this is that consciousness is actually an intensifier. It That's what it does. When it's active, it takes the human makeup of mind, body, and emotion and intensifies it. So this can mean trouble for us if our emotions are negative and if they are painful and tormenting. Uh, Instead of just experiencing those emotions on an animalistic level, we experience them through our endowment of consciousness, which intensifies them and makes them very powerful and very hard to deal with. And so consciousness, you might say that it's been doing this since the very beginning. If you follow the Bible's account of Adam, we see the very next account is of Adam's sons, Cain and Abel. And we see two very distinct outworkings in those two sons of consciousness. We see Abel tending toward a more spiritual life and a more aware, conscious, enlightened, elevated human existence. And we see Cain also with consciousness at work, but as an intensifier with his dark emotions, which he was not able to control. It became so intense. And so that has been really the history of this age, is that consciousness has been active in the human scene on both a negative and a positive scale. So how has consciousness shown itself in the secular world? This is something that a lot of people are confused about because they see the religious spiritual aspect of consciousness, but they cannot put that in the same place as a secular expression. So what we need to understand is that throughout this age, consciousness has been expressing itself in the life of human beings, in the society of human beings, in ways that are amazing, in ways that separate human beings from other created species. And this is very clear that human beings somewhere along the way became very different than the other species. We became, a lot of people just think that we became more intelligent, but actually what made us different is this endowment of consciousness. And there can be no doubt now that we parted ways with the other species, and we not only parted ways with them, but we became their master. And the reason has to do with consciousness. Consciousness from the very beginning has expressed itself in human circles, whether they were spiritually inclined or religious or not. And the way that it has done this is a way that many of us take for granted, because we've been living with human life as consciousness inspired. We've been living with this for many, many centuries and thousands of years. And so we see consciousness at work. We see that human beings have had and have still a very powerful inclination to know things, to know the mysteries of the universe, to know what makes our bodies work, to know what our environment is like and how it works, to have knowledge. And this knowledge we have codified into what is now called science. And science is it has been like a light in the human world, bringing us knowledge of the truth of our environment and of our own makeup and of many other things. Uh, and this has been clearly consciousness at work. No other species has science. No other species has this kind of knowledge. They have a certain kind of intelligence, and most often that intelligence is instinctual. And for instance, a survival intelligence. Even an ant has the intelligence to want to survive. But they do not have the knowledge, the higher knowledge that mankind has aspired to in his sciences. Another place that we see consciousness at work in the secular world is in invention. Mankind, a long time ago, found out that we could make our situation, our living situation in this world, we could improve it through the um, visioning of invention and the manifesting of that vision. We could make our discomfort that all creatures have, discomfort at times to do with environmental aspects such as heat and cold. But we, among all the species, have the capability to invent um, ways to ease our discomfort. We can invent, we can build homes, we can invent um, heating systems and cooling systems. And but it's much more than that. We can invent electric light bulbs that give us light when it's dark outside and when every other species is groping in that darkness. Mankind has this capability of invention, and that also has to do with consciousness. It's an outworking of consciousness. And there's another aspect too. Um, that aspect has to do with the creative arts, such as music and oh, there's so many arts that we enjoy that we take for granted. Film, um, visual arts, many arts, literature, and this creative ability of mankind is not just mental, it actually is a visionary ability that has to do, it has its source in our endowment of consciousness. And so we see that these are the aspects, without even having religion or God or anything like that, in in our outworking, we actually see that there are many aspects of human consciousness that have elevated mankind that are what we would call secular, that they're just part of regular human society, and and they have been active for 6,000 years, ever since Adam awoke to his consciousness. And that, again, doesn't mean that human life has not been a struggle. It has been a struggle for us in many ways. And uh, even though we've had this light of consciousness, we've also had the parts of ourselves to deal with intensified by consciousness that are very difficult. And so there has been, this is the source of human suffering in this age. But the good news is that consciousness is not like when people think religiously about the judgment of God. Consciousness is not trying to make us suffer. Consciousness can and will ultimately deliver us into a pure, enlightened state. So we, right now, what we have to understand is that we're suffering not because of consciousness, but because of the state of consciousness that is our present state and has been for 6,000 years. This is the source of our suffering. It's a well-defined state that is limiting, and we've had it's what we might call a seed state. When you look at life in the environment, you see many instances of created life that begin as a seed and then they evolve into a higher form. And so it is with human consciousness. We have been in a seed state, the state of Adam, and that is what has caused us a good deal of suffering during this age. It is the limitations of this state of Adam. And we can understand this uh, simply by looking at human history. It's also written in the parable of Adam and Eve that the outworking of human consciousness in this age has been um, limited by um, on the one hand, a sense of separation, a sense of being cut off from um, life itself. And what this has given rise to is the Darwinian structure of human society where everybody is fending for themselves because everybody feels separate on a very deep level. And that means that there's no one that can help us except ourselves. That is a outworking of Adamic consciousness, of the seed state. And it has caused great suffering throughout this age. And the other aspect is the knowledge of good and evil. Now, the knowledge of good and evil is actually uh, not a bad thing. It's an outworking of consciousness that is very elevated. Uh, in the Bible, it says that when God saw that Adam ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, he said he has now become like us, like one of the gods. And so it's not that the knowledge of good and evil is limiting and dark and negative in itself. The problem is that in this state of consciousness that we're in right now, we brought evil into equal prominence with good. And when that happened, we basically became subject to evil in ways that it mastered us. And this has been history throughout the age, that men have not been able to overcome the temptation of evil. And this is tied to our sense of separation. When we feel separate and on our own, we feel desperate and we feel basically like we'll do anything we need to do in order to make our way in life, including um, an evil course. And everybody knows what this means. It means, in some cases, it means murder. In some cases, it means lustful outworking between men and women. In some cases, it means stealing, coveting. These are all evil. They are evil choices that have become very much a part of human society because we have been unable to say no to them in our present state of consciousness. So this is uh, all of this is indicative of the Adamic state, and all of this is why we suffer. But the good news is that human evolution, human consciousness is evolutionary. And we didn't know that when we awoke to it. We awoke in the seed state, and nobody told us that we would evolve out of that seed state at some point. Um, we have to find that out for ourselves, and we have had to find that out for ourselves. And why is this good news? Because it shows that human consciousness is not um, evil. It's not trying to make us suffer. It's actually holding out the promise of an incredible life experience for human beings, a life experience that includes the glory of of full knowledge of God, of perfect harmony, the perfection of being. This is the promise of consciousness, and the way that we can come into this promise and realize that we've been mistaking about that. We've been on the wrong path. We've thought that through our human ingenuity in Adam, through our mental processes, through our strength, that we could bring it about ourselves. But we can't. It is an evolutionary outcome, which means it's governed by law, universal created law. And what that means is that going back to the very beginning, when God created us with the endowment of consciousness, God knew that this endowment was evolutionary according to universal law. And that means that it was as good as finished in God's sight. Um, Man would have to go through the seed state period, but it was guaranteed that human consciousness would arrive at its ultimate enlightened state at some point. It was the only thing that was not known was when. Um, and the way that this would happen would be through natural, scientific, legal processes, um, not by our own strength, but by law, by science, by human evolution, human consciousness evolving as evolution is wont to do. And this is the reality that we have to look forward to if we can hold on. And you may wonder, how can we know this is true and it's not just imaginary or fantastical? How can this vision of the perfection of being actually be a reality and not just a fantasy. And the way that we know is very interesting. It's also in the Bible. And you understand now as I speak that my view of the Bible is not as a religious text, it's as a prophetic, parabolic teaching text. Because Adam um, taught us about this age. Adam, the story of Adam taught us everything that we need to know about why this age has been like it's been. And then the Bible brings forth another man named Jesus. And Jesus is not a religious icon. That's where we've gone wrong. Jesus was a man who had evolved further out of the seed state of Adam. Jesus had realized the new state that I'm referring to, that is so hopeful. Jesus had uh, done that. And he had done it not by his own strength, but again by the evolutionary outworking of human consciousness, which is by law. Remember that Adam awoke to consciousness through that same evolutionary process by law, not by his own doing. Adam was no different than the other members of the Homo sapien community, but he awoke. And it happened because consciousness is an evolutionary endowment. And the same holds true for Jesus. Only Jesus represents the next rung on the ladder, the next step for mankind, the higher step in out of the seed state and into the full planting, the full glory state of the Christ. We call it the Christ. It's just a name. It's not a religious symbol. We can call it the Christ, or we can call it the Jesus man, or we can call it whatever. But it's the new consciousness. But it is the next step. And the reason that this is so important is because when we can read about Jesus and we can see that he was a real person who had come into this state, there's no reason to to believe that the same is not possible for us. He was a human being, and so are we human beings. And in fact, everything about Jesus, the way he was and what he taught, speaks of the fact that he knew who he was and he knew uh, what he was doing in terms of visiting us, in terms of showing us, in terms of helping us to come forth into this higher expression of human consciousness. That's who he was. And this is so important for us, my friends, to realize, because it doesn't really involve God. You know, God created us and he created all of life, and he did so out of his own consciousness. And he created us with this scientific evolutionary endowment of life. And that is our God experience, the unfoldment of our evolutionary instincts is what will bring this to pass. It will bring mankind into the higher state of the Christ, not our own strength. Really nothing that we can do in Adam can hasten it. All we need to do is to allow our evolutionary instincts to come out and to find expression. And in many ways, we have been restricting this ourselves. We are the ones who have been holding ourselves back. And one of the reasons for that is this choice of evil, that we have been unable to resist evil. And the many people that have chosen to embrace evil during this age, they don't want it to end because they have prospered in this situation. And so they've been holding us back. But when that which has been holding us back gives way, our evolutionary instincts will kick in all on their own, and the same thing will happen to us that happened to the man Jesus. We too will come into the Christ state of consciousness, and we too will realize the fullness of human suffering, of human consciousness, that it is not uh, an endowment meant to cause us suffering, but is an endowment with incredible potential to not only change human life, but elevate it beyond anything that we can imagine right now. And so this is our hope. This is what consciousness is really been all about. And I think more and more people are understanding this. And as they do, um, of course, what we're going to see some changes according to this understanding. We're going to see religion loosen its grip on a lot of people, and we're going to see the spiritual expression of consciousness become more and more purified and stronger and streamlined. Uh, we don't need religion. We don't need doctrine. We just need to allow our endowment of consciousness to do what it was created to do.